This afternoon, we're going to hear Ed Castellini lecture on place. If you know the novel, you know he's quoting the novel Haunted by Places, freely quoting it and mixing in your own focus on place. So Ed's going to take us to Montana. I'll say a few words by way of introducing Ed Castellini, and then I'll turn it over to Ed. But first, I just want to mention in memory of Robert C. Kelly, who taught here for many years and who was always an enthusiastic supporter of this program, the Work of Literary Merit program. And the English department, as always, is grateful to the Kelly family for their support of this series. Ed, my colleague Ed Castellini, has taught a number and a wide range of courses in the English department since he joined us in fall 1993. He'd actually been working for the JC back in '79, so he tells me, in what was then called the Learning Skills program, is now the Disability Resources Department. Ed went on to get a PhD in English and American Literature at UC Davis in 1991, writing his dissertation on Henry David Thoreau and his philosophy of language. He has also published an article and given presentations on his research and has written for other publications and undertaken watershed and environmental work besides teaching composition and literature at the JC and other institutions of higher learning. He has greatly enjoyed reading and teaching A River Runs Through It, seeing some hints of Thoreau, maybe more than some hints, maybe some strong connections. Maybe we'll hear about that. And has found the book thoroughly healthy, fresh, loving, and profound. And here he is to tell us more about it. Thanks, Ed.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming. And I must say it's great to be a teacher here, since I see at least half the audience is my class. Compelled to come to the lecture. Hello. All right. So, the very final sentence of this magical book, this novella, A River Runs Through It, compresses into one beautiful, pithy, aphoristic sentence. Norman Maclean's total impression that everything that's happened, all that had happened in the book up to this point, all the rivers he'd fished in, the mountains he'd seen, the valleys he'd traversed, the sky he'd fished under, his mother and father and brother and wife and his in-laws, all the people he knew and loved, all tried to sum it all up into one final sentence that he puts at the very end of the book, which is, I am haunted by waters. I'm haunted by waters. And he selected the suggestive word haunted out of his sense that all the places he visits in his imagination in this book have a certain kind of soul for him. These haunted places are filled by ghosts, memories, souls, the subtle natural presences of the rivers and mountains, and maybe even the souls of the bigger fish that he remembers catching too. And I should mention at the outset that A River Runs Through It was first published in 1976, when Norman Maclean was 73 years old and had retired from his professorship in the Department of English at the University of Chicago. So it's a lifetime of memories and ghosts and soul presences that the writer pours into this book. Now, although Norman Maclean says that the rivers and mountains are haunted, he insists on their reality, their concrete, actual reality. I'm quoting him in an article. He says, for any number of reasons, everyday reality must be present there in my book. Ultimately, I suppose, because it is there in life, reality is the transition between beauty and darkness, making both beauty and darkness believable. So the place to start our lecture, and even this lecture series, is with the concrete everyday physical reality of western Montana as Norman Maclean knew it and experienced it. And so then the first thing I would like to do in this talk is to give you an introduction by way of a series of maps and photographs of some of the places in western Montana near and dear to this writer's heart and depicted in loving detail in this book. Now, after taking in this presentation today, you, readers and students and teachers, should be better able to appreciate the spectacular settings woven into the plot and woven about the characters. So our first questions, therefore, are these. What's the geography of Montana, and especially western Montana? Where and what are its rivers, watersheds, divides, townships, people, places, so near and dear to this author and mentioned in here? And our ultimate question for the book must be, what is the full reality of this book, this author's full reality, so that both physical Montana and its realistic characters who populate this book, and on the other hand, a metaphysical, what we could call transcendental Montana, with its ideas and ghosts that haunt Montana, its light, its beauty, its darkness. So the ultimate question is, how do these both physical and metaphysical reality haunt or populate this book? And before I go on, I should tell you that I use the word metaphysical in its strict sense, its philosophical sense for over 2,000 years, simply meaning beyond the physical. And clearly in this look at Montana, and Maclean's look on Montana, he sees a physical / metaphysical reality, with both sides of reality equally important for him. So here's how we start. This is a map of Montana. I just wanted to show you it because Montana is a very interesting state. And I should confess, too, at the beginning, I've never been to Montana. So everything I have to say about Montana is learned from Maclean and from maps and things like that. Whoa, what happened to Montana? There it is. Well, just because I said I hadn't been there, please. Okay. White on this side, green on this side. So that's eastern Montana, a very different kind of country than western Montana. And there's a very sharp distinction in geography between the east and the west. In fact, an incredibly sharp distinction in geography. So western Montana is a land of mountain ranges, rivers coursing down valleys, and broad plains interspersed with towns. Now, here is a more concentrated look at western Montana. Let's see if I can do this. Whoa. So this is western Montana. The most very important thing, and the slide maybe is not so good, is this little checked line, and it runs down like this and runs all the way up into Canada, right along the spine of the Rocky Mountains. And do you remember what that line depicts? That's called the Continental Divide. Okay? And so any rain that falls on the east side of the Continental Divide goes into the Atlantic Ocean eventually, down the Missouri River, the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. Any rain that falls on this side goes into the Columbia River and eventually into the Pacific Ocean. And now this divide, the Continental Divide, is very important in this book. Both both his brother and Maclean in the book live on the east side of the divide. And to get good fishing, they have to drive across the divide. And you'll find in the book that our author says, crossing the divide is a mental, or he says it's a mental and moral achievement. And they have Continental Divide stories that they tell each other. And Norman Maclean even says, I was attempting to cross the divide between he and I, between my brother and I. So the Continental Divide is very central in this. Now, the Continental Divide is, let's see if I can find this. Yeah, I'm sorry the slide is so poor. This is Missoula, Montana here. And this is where Norman Maclean was raised from the age of 7. And he writes, now if I can go to the very beginning of the book, he says, I lived at the junction of great trout rivers in western Montana. Well, I was very interested to find out what these great trout rivers were. So Missoula here is truly at a junction. There's a river that comes up from the south here called the Bitterroot River. There's a river that comes over this way called the Clark Fork River. And then there's the famous river, which appears in this book again and again, that comes from the east. And it kind of all ties in a knot around Missoula. So indeed, he did grow up and live at the junction of great trout rivers. In fact, maybe if you were a fly fisherman and a trout fisherman, that's the place to be brought up, Missoula, Montana. Okay. And his father was let's see, I can turn this off. So his father was a Presbyterian minister and a fly fisherman, and had taught Norman and his brother right from their youth up. Now, I thought that you should see a photograph of a river just north of Missoula. I got this photograph from Peggy Miller of Missoula, Montana, and I appreciate that very much. She cooperated in helping me put this lecture together. And this photo and each of the following are taken from photos she sent me just over the last couple weeks. Now, that's one of the rivers that I think runs into this junction of great rivers. And I thought you should see how wide it is. And also, you get some idea of the valleys and mountains of Montana. The valleys you see are pretty narrow, and the rivers run very swiftly and coursing down these valleys. So again, I give my gratitude towards Peggy Miller, who is the proprietor of a Highland Winds Medicinal Herbs and Arts shop in Missoula, Montana. Okay. Now, Peggy Miller made a special point of saying, the river runs through it. That means the river runs through Missoula. And indeed, this is Missoula, Montana. And you can see this is the Clark Fork River that runs right through the middle of town, right by the multi-story buildings and the main parts of campus. And this could be springtime, maybe before the leaves bud out, and you have a chance to see the river and the banks and the mountains and the somewhat of the city there. And lest we forget that Montana is very different than California, this is the way it must look many months of the year. This is also Missoula, and the river runs through it again in the wintertime. Now, I was talking with Peggy, and I said, does the First Presbyterian Church still exist there in Missoula? The one that Norman Maclean's father was the pastor of? And she said, I don't know. Let me go up and look. And she went up, and she came back very excited and took this picture. which is a plaque in front of the church, the First Presbyterian Church, in memory of Dr. John Norman Maclean, pastor of First Presbyterian Church from 1909 to 1925, whose love of God, family, and creation inspired the story, A River Runs Through It. And construction of the sanctuary designed by his friend and church member, Missoula architect A.J. Gibson. So that's Norman Maclean's father. And we know from the first paragraphs of this book that Norman's father, being a minister, had a tremendous effect on Norman, the writer of the book, himself. For example, one day a week, Norman Maclean writes, was given over entirely to religion. And as far as his father goes, the pastor here, he says of his father, as a Scot and a Presbyterian, my father believed that man by nature was a mess and had fallen from the original state of grace. So Norman Maclean spent many a Sunday and other days at this site. And although he does say, in a typical week, my brother Paul and I probably received as many hours of instruction in fly fishing as we did in all other spiritual matters. And one thing I especially found interesting about this plaque was that apparently the father's name was John Norman, and so our writer, Norman, must have gotten passed down to him his father's name, Norman. And I think that's interesting because a lot more got passed down than just his name, Norman. To his son, the writer of this book, went his father's tutoring in fly fishing, in spiritual matters, in academic matters. He was actually homeschooled by his father. He inherited a religious outlook and a sense for both sides of reality. And so it's true that John Norman Maclean truly was an inspirer of this novel. And there's the church, and you can see the little plaque. But I doubt that this is the church as Norman Maclean preached in it. This is a new construction and quite a very large and imposing church, as a matter of fact. Now, this is the Blackfoot River. And this is a very precise location on the Blackfoot River. It is precisely the place in the Blackfoot River that this book talks about. And precisely it says, the canyon above the old Clearwater Bridge is where the Blackfoot River roars loudest. This river, which runs straight and hard, and where the river roars, it'd be nice if you could hear it roar, sorry about that, and where the water is too fast to let the algae grow on the rocks. So this is one of the great trout streams of the West. And you can see that it's no small little creek or tiny river, but truly the big Blackfoot River, as the author calls it. And this is the last slide I have. This is Seeley Lake. So a whole series of adventures take place at Seeley Lake. Norman Maclean and his family had a cabin near here. And now, notice the difference. The lake is not roaring. There's no tumultuous water here. The water is quiet. The landscape is more meditative. And actually, Norman Maclean returned to his cabin here well up into his 80s in this country. So this is a place, a Seeley Lake, where Norman can meditate on the river's meanders and pools and take us more into the philosophical depths of this book. Okay. So I'll just leave the Blackfoot River there since it comes up again and again in this book. And now we're going to talk a little bit about what's harder than watching photographs of Montana. Because now what's harder is not just seeing the places that the writer puts into the book, but to see the actual themes and ideas of Norman Maclean. So now starts the metaphysical part of this talk. And Norman Maclean himself is quite clear about how to read his book. So if you're going to have to read this, take note of what's on page 92. In fact, this author is very precise. And I'm going to read you a little bit of this from page 92. He, that is Paul, gave me a pat on the back. They're fishing this river at some place. He gave me a pat on the back and one of George's number 2 yellow hackles with a feather wing. He said, "They are feeding on drowned stoneflies." As the trout were feeding on drowned stoneflies. I asked him, "How did you think that out?" He thought back on what had happened like a reporter. He started to answer, shook his head when he found he was wrong, and then started out again. "All there is to thinking," he said, "is seeing something noticeable, which makes you see something you weren't noticing, which makes you see something that isn't even visible." As I said, that's a sort of a key to how to interpret this book. And you can deduce from this quote that the writer's strategy and method is to progress from seeing something noticeable to seeing something you could have noticed but didn't, and finally, in the end, to see something that's not even visible at all, but there. And of course, it's what's invisible that haunts you and me and haunts the writer too. You could even say there's 2 kinds of trout. The first trout is the ones with scales and gills and teeth, and you catch them here on flies. And the other trout is the trout of thought and imagination. And for this writer, Montana is the home of both types of trout. Okay, now that we've gotten some picture of the grandeur of this country, and really Montana is so beautiful and spectacular, we can now look at what he says about the Montana that can't be seen, which is, we could call it metaphorical, we could call it metaphysical, and we certainly have to use our imagination and cooperate with him. And I'm going to give you 3 pictures, but not pictures that are on my laptop here. But now these are going to be word pictures. You can't strictly see these word pictures, but you must notice something about them so that the full physical, metaphysical reality of Montana, as Maclean knew it, can emerge from your reading of the book. You haven't read this book if you think it's about physical Montana. It's about physical, metaphysical Montana. So the first word picture begins on page 19. Here we are back at the Blackfoot River in the canyon above the old Clearwater Bridge. And having caught a fine large trout himself, Norman says, and he caught it first before his brother, "I had a fish, so I sat down to watch a fisherman." And here's what he sees when he watches his brother fishing this river. Below him was the multitudinous river. Would you think of using that word for this river? Multitudinous? Multitudinous. And where the rock had parted it around him, big grained vapor rose. He was fishing from a rock in the middle of the river. The spray emanating from him was finer grained still, and enclosed him in a halo of himself. The halo of himself was always there and always disappearing, as if he were candlelight flickering about 3 inches from himself. The images of himself and his line kept disappearing into the rising vapors of the river, which constantly circled to the tops of the cliffs, where, after becoming a wreath in the wind, they became rays of the sun. So you really have to work there to see rivers producing vapor and slowly moving towards the top of the canyon together with the images of Paul fishing. That's a sort of a higher self of Paul, as it were, right up into the sunlight. So he's a halo, an image, and something rising. And what Paul is doing in the river is also physical, metaphysical. So this is the way Maclean describes his brother. He was 32 now, at the height of his power, and he could put all his body and soul into a 4.5-ounce magic totem pole. That's a 4.5-ounce fly rod, okay? But in this river, it's become a magic totem pole, because after all, his brother has a halo and is rising in the vapors. And what does Maclean say about this whole valley? He says rhythm was just as important as color and just as complicated. The canyon was glorified by rhythms and colors, glorified by his brother fishing there and producing such beautiful rhythms and colors. So you see, the metaphysical is complicated, but it also glorifies the canyon, it glorifies the act of fishing, it glorifies Paul, it glorifies Norman. Now, Maclean was haunted by this scene. And he describes a man and woman out hiking who stopped to notice this person fishing in the middle of this river. And working wonders with this magical casting and some sort of shadow casting and figure 8 loops. And they stop to see the prize trout that Paul hooks and watch his fantastic casting. And then they try to engage Norman, who's also on the side, in a conversation. Norman says, "I started to make for the next hole." "Oh no," she said, that is the lady who was passing by. "You're going to wait, aren't you? Until he comes to shore so you can see his big fish." "No," Norman answered. "I'd rather remember the molecules." The molecules. As I kept going, the middle of my back told me that I was being viewed from the rear, both as quite a guy because I was his brother and also as a little bit nutty because I said I was molecular. So you see, you can be accused of being a little bit nutty if you see the metaphysical and transcendental in the physical. However, Maclean is not afraid of that, and he's not afraid of being called nutty. So why read Maclean's musings on the river? Or in fact, is Norman Maclean thinking, and the woman who engages him in conversation and thinks he's nutty, is she not thinking? That is, has she missed something about this river? Has she missed seeing something noticeable which leads you step by step to making you see something that isn't even visible, but's there? So Maclean does the same kind of thing with all of the scenes in the book again and again and again. He begins with the real physical and finds in it, draws out of it the metaphysical. I'll give you another example. So he goes to Seeley Lake, and I think you remember Seeley Lake, a more meditative spot. Not the roaring Blackfoot, but something else. And he goes fishing on a river that's not very far from here, and he says, "I sat there by the river and forgot until what remained was the river that went by and I who watched. Eventually, the watcher joined the river, and there was only one of us." I believe it was the river. There's only one of us. So the watcher and the river join and become one. And now this is a quiet meditative thought and a quiet meditative stretch of the river, and it haunts Maclean to the extent that it haunts his memory. And he writes, "But years ago I had known the river where it flowed through a now dry channel so I could enliven its stony remains with the waters of memory." So memory itself flows. Memories like waters. And a river is like the flow of memory. And so that's a challenge to all of us. Are our memories flowing like rivers? Are our memories drying up? Have our memories already dried up? So in this meditative moment, the river is so alive that where it dries up, Maclean says, it died. So here's what he says about the death of the river. In death it had its pattern, and we, means we humans, can only hope for as much. Let's hope we, when we die, are as together and have said as much and done as much as a river. And finally, a last touch of the metaphysical from Seeley Lake. As the heat mirages on the river danced with and through each other, he writes, I could feel patterns from my own life joining with them. It was here, while waiting for my brother, that I started this story. Then Maclean goes on to say, stories of life are often more like rivers than books. So now you can already see the play of words beginning in the title. Stories of life are often more like rivers than books, and a river runs through it. So it could be life, it could be Montana, it could be a great deal. Okay, so one more picture. And now we go back to the Blackfoot River. Maybe, let's see. Maybe that's a better picture. So now a third picture, but a little disregarding this, but a picture that you can draw in your words and imagination. Comes out of the book's conclusion. So I've gone from the beginning to the middle, now to the end of the book, where Paul, Norman, and their father fished the Blackfoot River one final time at a new, more tranquil spot. The river just above, in the book, it says, just above the mouth of Belmont Creek. And I can't find Belmont Creek, and I'm not even completely sure that this is the Blackfoot River, but this is the kind of more tranquil stretch that they would have fished. Now, by this point in the book, the river has truly become both metaphysical and physical, so that Norman Maclean says, he says, there was only one of us, so, and he says, it, the river, his father says, don't you hear the logos or the word in this river? Now can actually speak. So now the river is actually going to talk in the book to you and to Norman Maclean. So now listen to the voice of the river. You might have seen the halos or the vapor, but now the river actually takes on a voice. The voices of the subterranean river in the shadows. So where this river is in the shadows is he calls subterranean. And where the river is in the sun, he says it comes up out into the sunlight. The voices of the subterranean river in the shadows were different from the voices of the sunlit river ahead. In the shadows against the cliff, the river was deep and engaged in profundities, circling back on itself now and then to say things over. To be sure, the river had understood itself. But the river ahead came out into the sunny world like a chatterbox, doing its best to be friendly. So the river alternates between darkness and light. And in this passage where the river sings both of darkness and sunlit beauty, this passage now becomes believable. Believable because the scene, because now, if we follow Maclean at all, we see that Montana has become physical metaphysical. And out on that river, as Norman and his father watch, is Paul. So Paul is going to catch his last fish, and he wants it to be the biggest fish of the day. And his father and Norman are watching him fish. And as they watch, they see in his hand the fly rod, and Norman Maclean says, that's a wand. It's a magic wand. And they're there listening to the river again, and the river starts talking even more of its profundities, as Maclean says. A river, though, has so many things to say that it is hard to know what it says to each of us. As we were packing our tackle and fish in the car, Paul repeated, "Just give me 3 more years." At the time, I was surprised at the repetition. So Paul had said that twice. But later I realized that the river, somewhere, sometime, must have told me, too, that Paul would receive no such gift. So you see here the river is sort of an oracle or sibyl or prophet, and the river knows the fates of the people that are on its banks. And where does the river get its words? The father, John Norman Maclean, says, "From underneath the water come the fatal words of destiny." Okay. So, now we have arrived at the end of the book, and perhaps I've said enough about its physical, metaphysical nature. And now, if we follow the book and we follow Norman Maclean, we know why a river runs through it. Yeah, why does a river run through it? And now we also know why he is haunted by waters. Very clear writer in that sense. Now we know it by the end. So, what has Maclean taught us or prompted us to see in this river? So remember, what should we be seeing? What should we be noticing? And how can we learn to see what is there but not visible? And so what haunts the waters of western Montana for Norman Maclean? Well, if you, reading this book, have learned to see or notice something in it, capital I-T, in it, something physical, metaphysical, then you are indeed reading Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It. And just as that river has become one with him and runs through him, so that river, in some measure, is meant, and the writer intends this very seriously, to run through you, and this river includes you too. The river of this book is you. So that's what I had to say about that, and I'm just wondering if there were any questions from anyone. Any requests to see another slide? Yes.
It's strange to me that the brother Paul, who reaches this perfection in his ability to fly fish,
Yes.
goes into such darkness and depths in the other part of his life. It's just a strange opposite. Makes
Well,
you wonder why his transcendence as a fisherman couldn't help him transcend the darkness that he plummets into.
yes, that puts a major dilemma of the book beautifully into focus. So why does Norman Maclean have such a beautiful picture of Montana? Why does he live a productive life as a professor? Why does his brother, shortly after this last fishing trip where he heard the river, why does his brother find himself? Why does his brother get into so much trouble that he finds him that his brother Norman finds him murdered in an alley in Helena, Montana? Murdered in a back alley, actually clubbed to death by the butt of a pistol. Okay, so there's a continental divide between he and his brother, and Norman says again and again, I could never fully fathom the nature of this divide. So I wisely, I think, Norman says, I finally accepted my brother as he was. And as he was a perfect artist. His brother says he was probably the finest fly fisherman in the Pacific Northwest. That I don't know exactly, because I don't know what makes the finest fly fisherman, but that's quite a claim, right? And so the darkness of Paul coincided with a certain greatness. And Norman Maclean has come to peace about that. I think one of the reasons he says he's haunted is because up till a certain point in his life, he couldn't make peace with these mysteries of life. If that's okay. Yes? Yeah. That's the inference the book leaves, yeah.
Whether it's gambling, alcohol, drugs, whatever, but that dark side. And for me, it's a beautiful reminder to honor both sides of ourselves, that we do have a light side and a dark side, and then to look for the place, since this is a novel about place.
Yes.
Look for the place where the light side is elicited, and to look for those places that elicit that darker side.
Oh, that's beautifully put. I think that would have been a message from this book. Norman Maclean would have said, possibly, this is a moral tale. This is a tale about light and darkness and their interplay in all of our lives, and not blaming the darkness for being dark, but seeing that it, just like the river, has to run through darkness and into sunlight, so our lives have to do that too. And simply, this is one of the things we must learn to accept about from our nature. Now, a lot of this book too is about how can Norman and his father and their friends help him. See, how can he help you get rid of your darkness? Well, has anybody in this class ever tried to help somebody out of their darkness? Right? And yes, yes. Well, we try, but at a certain point, you have to accept a person's particular mix of darkness and light as being part of their intrinsic self, and to love what's beautiful about Paul, who was an alcoholic and a gambler and reckless with his money, and as Norman Maclean says, otherwise had a pack string of women chasing him around, and all these other unsavory things. But still, he was the finest fly fisherman in the Pacific Northwest, and a fishing rod in his hand became a magic wand. And I'm not going to stand here and make the book simplistic, because it's not. The river must run through the shadows and the darkness, as well as through the sunlight, says Norman Maclean. Well, is that it? Oh, yes. Yes.
Has she talked to you at all about how this book is viewed in Missoula? Is it the thing they're proud of? Do they identify themselves with this book? Is it something everyone reads in school? Or how? I know that class, for example.
Yeah. I know. I was very interested in this. So you see, before I started this lecture, I said to myself, well, isn't this book kind of like John Steinbeck's books, like Cannery Row, that sort of put Monterey on the map, and everybody in Monterey supposedly reads it, supposedly. And so I wrote several people, and I said, did you read the book? Did you read the book? Finally, I found one person who said, I love that book. Not a professor at the university, but a proprietor of an herb shop. And and we were able to have a good conversation and exchange of emails, and she just started taking pictures. So you're the beneficiary of somebody who loved the book. Now, as far as my tapping into this deep appreciation and love of Norman Maclean in western Montana, well, I didn't find it, Anne-Marie. But that's not to say it's not there. I just, with my limited experience, didn't find a particular groundswell. But I found one person. Well, all right. I'll give you a very concrete example of that. I said to Peggy Miller, I said, well, is there a First Presbyterian church in town? She said, yeah. I said, do you think Pastor John Norman Maclean was the pastor? She says, I don't know. So I said, oh. She said, well, it's just up the street from me. I think I'll go find out. So there you see. Actually, Missoula is indebted to this lecture in a little way. So do people in Missoula pass this plaque and go, yes, a river runs through it? Sorry, can't answer that. Have to do more research. Yes?
How did you get in contact with Peggy Miller, and how did you try and find somebody that knew something about the book in Missoula?
Oh.
Because that seems like it'd be kind of a difficult task.
Yes. You send emails out into the ether, right? And you hope they strike root. Actually, I went through a chain of about 4 or 5 different people, each of whom referred me to somebody else. And I have to give people in Montana credit for even if they didn't know much about the book or didn't know much about the scenes of the book, still were kind enough to refer me to somebody else. So, isn't on the 6th? Isn't it every 6th person knows somebody else? Is there something like that? 6 degrees? Well, I got to about 6 degrees before I found Peggy Miller. Yeah. And I'm also very grateful to her conversation as well. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, we are right on time. It's 5 minutes of. So we can all get off to my next class. Oh, thank you, Chiron. Your grade's just gone up. All right.